The Attorney General's letter on the Robert Mueller report stirs the country. It says Mueller cleared Trump and his people, including his children, on the Russian front. Barr quotes from Mueller's report that the investigation, quote, did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Well, that's the box office news of the weekend, because if Mueller had found evidence of a crime there, the calls for impeachment would have been resounding and could even have reached Republicans. But he didn't. As a consequence, Republicans are now even less likely to back impeachment, and certainly not conviction and removal from office. But now comes the big stickler, obstruction of justice. According to Barr's letter released to Congress late yesterday, Mueller did not draw any conclusion as to whether Trump had committed a crime here. What Barr then did, quote, the evidence is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Well, that's because, according to Barr, the report identifies no actions that were done with corrupt intent. In other words, Barr reviewed Mueller's 2-year investigation over the course of 2 days and ruled that the president had not obstructed justice. Well, reacting to that news yesterday, the president was quick to claim exoneration, of course, and then attack the investigation itself.
It was a complete and total exoneration. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown that failed.
Well, the president's claim of exoneration, however, is at odds with Mueller's characterization of his findings on possible obstruction of justice. According to Attorney General Barr's own letter, the special counsel specifically said, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. All this has intensified calls to release the special counsel's full report, as well as the underlying evidence he collected. I'm joined right now by Shannon Pettypiece, Bloomberg News White House reporter, Caroline Frederickson, president of the American Constitution Society, Mimi Rocca, of course, former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Thank you all for joining us. I want to start with Shannon. What's the difference between the political, legal, constitutional reality we faced 5 minutes to 5 last Friday and now? What's big in change in the cosmos?
Politically, I don't know if much has changed. And I've been talking to a lot of people about this. I know, Democrats really hitched their wagon to this argument, but that's not what voters cared about. They cared about the economy, health care, and that's what the presidential candidates were talking about. Legally, I don't think the president is in any more legal jeopardy than he was before this. There is this opening for Democrats that you pointed out, with Mueller saying that he is not charging him with a crime, yet he is not exonerating him. That gives Democrats an opening to pursue this and to call for the full report to be released. I think that is going to be difficult for Barr to do, because so much of what Barr collected was grand jury testimony, classified information, or things covered by executive privilege. But if the Democrats want to wage that fight, they can do so. And it could be a court battle that could play out for years, just like these other battles over releasing documents have played out. So, but I don't know if that's a path the Democrats want to go down. I think some will pursue it, but I think you're going to see the party try and shift the topic to something else that voters are more interested in, health care.
Well, I'm interested in whether the president committed a crime or not. Let me get back to Mimi Rocca. Every crime show I watched, my favorite was The Good Wife for years. But I have to tell you, there's something I saw in the face of the reality, which was prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors get to decide what to do, whether prosecute or not. Why did Robert Mueller not decide? Why did he play Pontius Pilate here? Why did he pass the buck to Barr, who he knew was a Republican, who had written favorably of the president's position on obstruction of justice, passed it over to him and didn't use the 2-year investigation to make up his mind? Did the president or not obstruct justice? What's wrong with the question? And where's the answer?
Well, Chris, I don't know that Mueller did pass the buck to Barr. Look, we're recreating something here without knowing, all of the facts. And again, this is something that a release of the report might tell us. But it seems to me that what Mueller is not someone, he spent decades making hard decisions in his career. I do not view him as someone who would shy away from a decision just because it's hard for no good reason. It sounds to me like he came up with facts that were problematic for Trump, that pointed towards obstruction. But as Barr quotes Mueller as saying, there were, quote, difficult questions of law and fact. And Mueller felt that given that the president could not, under Department of Justice policy, be indicted, it was for Congress to resolve those questions.
He doesn't say that. I don't see that. I don't see that in the letter from Barr. Where did you know that he was thinking that the president couldn't be indicted? Where are you getting that from in this report? I haven't seen it yet.
Well, no, I'm saying that could be one of the difficult questions of law that Mueller was trying to resolve. And I think Mueller was trying to pass this over to Congress, and Barr swooped in and took it. There's nothing.
It would have been helpful to know that was his reason, because what we're getting here is difficult issues. We're getting questions. And if he had just said, I can't rule an indictment because we're not supposed to, according to the Justice Department guidelines, indict, and that would have saved us a lot of speculation here. My question is, why did he turn it over to a guy he knew was pro-Trump?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that was Mueller's intention. To quote my former boss, Preet Bharara, I think Mueller was punting the football to Congress, and Barr swooped in and intercepted it and took it out to the bleachers.
Okay, so that's a nice line. I agree with it. I want to go to Caroline. Hold on, Rima. I got a lot of respect for your judgment here, but I want to go to some other thoughts here. Caroline, it seems to me that the chain of custody of the report went right to Barr. So whatever his intentions were, he was turning over the authority to do what he wanted with that report to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General's position was pretty damn clear going into this, that he was pro-Trump. And then Mueller gets what he gave him, the hot potato. He took the hot potato, and in 48 hours, he decided to rule on the evidence of 2 years. Yeah, he just did it, and he had Rob Rosenstein helping him.
Right, and I think it's highly problematic. I mean, I think this is an attorney general who auditioned for this job by writing a letter to the president that said, I don't think a president can commit obstruction. So right off, you have to wonder about
Mueller knew this.
Right. Well,
and he turns over the report to a guy he knew didn't believe the president could be guilty.
I mean, Mueller, we don't know what Mueller. There wasn't really a clear alternative for him.
He could have made a decision.
But that's, well, certainly. But I think what Mimi said is most likely correct, that he, is guided by this Justice Department policy. We don't know it,
and he didn't say it.
But the fact of the matter that we don't know it is all the more reason why we need to see the report, why Mueller and Barr should have to go up to Congress and talk about it, testify. And I have to say, I disagree. I think we don't know, again, that most of what Mueller's collected can't be turned over to Congress because it's grand jury. I mean, Congress actually has a right to see grand jury material when it's related to it.
I want to go back to Mimi on this one more time past you. It seems to me that the report that we got, the pieces of it we got thanks to Barr, basically said, I'm not exonerating him, I'm not indicting him. Why would he go through all that if the reason either of those were relevant was that he couldn't indict the president to begin with? Why would he talk about weighing the evidence and all if it didn't matter how he weighed it? Because according to your reference, he couldn't indict.
Well, I mean, again, we don't know that was the only basis. I think that the OLC policy could be changed. OK, there's no question that it could be changed, but it could be that the facts did not cry out for that. Right. So you have to take the policy in combination with the facts. I'm not saying that Mueller did the right thing or didn't do the right thing. I don't know enough to pass judgment on someone like Bob Mueller right now sitting here. I can tell from Barr's letter that it seems to me the impression I'm left with is that he says Mueller didn't decide this. Well, here I'm going to. It's left to me to decide, and he inserts himself. And I don't know what gives him the authority to do that. I don't think it was appropriate. And I think most of all, releasing this letter with this pick and choose quote, partial sentences from Bob Mueller is just very unhelpful and quite prejudicial because it's giving a certain impression that is not the full picture right now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.